Hello and welcome to this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. And today I want to give an exploratory discussion relating to the ongoing events in the country of Niger, which is currently dominating the news cycle and increasingly having war drums beaten in the African country, which has faced numerous political episodes of instability. But before we get into that, let me just give briefly the history of the country. The country, Niger or Niger as some people could pronounce it, is located in Western Africa. It's a landlocked country and it takes its name from the Niger River, which flows through the southwestern part of its territory. And the name Niger derives in turn from the phrase Jane Jaren, meaning river among rivers, quote unquote, in the Tamashek language. Niger is home to several ethnic groups, the largest of which include the Hausa, the Songhai Zama, the Tuareg, and the country's capital is Niamey. The discussion also just briefly will focus on his history and as a summary from the 14th century, the country has period and of conquest, war, colonization, and various early cultures in the region. And this took it to the colonial administration following the French conquest, which began in 1899. And the local population determinedly resisted against the notorious brutal expedition in 1899, led by the French captains Paul Volley and Charles Paul Louis Chanoine, also known as Julien Chanoine. It was only in 1922, after the severe drought and famine of 1913 to 1915, that the Tuareg uprising of the 1916 and 17, that the French established a regular administration under civilian control. By then, the power of the Tuareg had been broken owing to those events. And elsewhere, the peace in the French West Africa, Pax Gallica, meant, among other things, the rapid spread of Islam, a steep demographic increase, and also exclusively among the Hausa, the extension of cash crop cultivation. The Songhai Zama, on the other hand, responded to the French tax demands by engaging themselves as seasonal laborers in the coastal regions. Through the reforms of 1946, France's African subjects were in theory granted full citizenship. Thus, Niger, along with the other colonies renamed overseas territories in Africa, was represented in the French Parliament. There was consultative legislative assemblies which were set up locally, and the reform secured the assent of tiny new elite, the so-called évolus, i.e. those who had been trained in French schools, a form of a class hierarchy. Many were descendants of formerly enslaved peoples, and most were Songhai Zama. And indeed, some of the West African in the West had proved to be far more stronger and resistant in comparison to other areas, and they were far more open, however, later on to European influence than, for instance, the Hausa um, in that country. Around 1954 or 1955, the French administration, headed for 12 years by Governor Jean Toby, remained firmly in control of the political situation, and the first local executive was established in 1957. Its head, the trade unionist Jabo Bakri, advocated a no vote in the referendum of 1958, but 72% of the votes were cast were in favor of a continued link with France, at least according to the reports. Now, whether or not that was an open and free referendum or plebiscite is a different matter, especially under the yoke of colonialism in favor of the colonial masters. Now, nevertheless, the under Bakri's successor, his cousin and fellow Songhai Zama, Hamani Diori, independence was proclaimed on August 3rd, 1960. That's, I think, three years after Ghana's 1957, I believe, and Egypt, which had earlier in the 50s also got independence. Now, after independence was proclaimed, Diori set up a single-party dictatorship and ruled until he was toppled in a coup in 1974. I think that sounds similar to many post-colonial countries, including or especially in Africa. Then there followed a military dictatorship headed first by Senyi Kunshe until he passed away in 1987, and then by Ali Saibu One of the Social Democrat Convention became the president in the country's first multi-party presidential elections in 1993. Now, meanwhile, after a Tuareg rebellion that had begun in the northern part of the country in the early 1990s, gained momentum until a ceasefire agreement was agreed in 1985, which ended much of the fighting. Osman was ousted in 1996 during a military coup, another one led by Colonel Ibrahim Bare Mainasara. After a brief period of military rule, Manasara was elected president in election reportedly marred by anomalies, and his administration was not well received, and in 1999 he was assassinated during a coup that was followed by a 9-month transitional government led by Major Dauda Malam Wanke and the National Reconciliation Council, known in French as Council de Réconciliation Nationale, in short CRN. Later that year, a new constitution was promulgated and elections were held, leading to the subsequent return to democratic government under President Mamadou Danja of the National Movement for Developing Society, Nasara Movement, in French known as Movement for National pour une Société de Développement, Nasara MNSD. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, there was increased demand for the adoption of Islamic Sharia law, not just in that country, but across the region and in some other areas in other countries, as we all know. At the beginning of, and this was the root of much of the conflict between Islamic people were proposing for more Islamic foothold in the day-to-day running of the country, and Nigerians who were not in favor of the strict religious code. So there was a struggle to maintain the fragile peace as well as to improve its dismal economic situation. Now, Tanger's leadership was widely credited with bringing political stability to the country and was re-elected in 2004. However, the issue of slavery as well was still prevalent in Niger and other West African countries, despite the fact that it is obviously illegal in every respect under international law. And it was brought to the fore in 2008 when the ECOWAS, which is the regional community, which is known in full as the Economic Community of Western African Countries, whose Court of Justice found the Nigerian government guilty of failing to protect a woman from slavery by not enforcing the country's anti-slavery laws. This was held as a verdict, as a historic verdict in terms of human rights victory, and there was optimism that the ruling would sort of encourage further enforcement of anti-slavery laws, not only in Niger, but also in other West African countries bound by the ECOWAS ruling. Now, what followed after that, there was a constitutional crisis in 2009. Under the two-term limit prescribed in the Constitution, Tanja was scheduled to step down from office in December 2009. But I think characteristically, not the only one, but in many other countries, in particular in African countries, that never tends to happen. And in the period leading up to 2009, as we see currently in Senegal, and we've seen in other countries, I think Cote d'Ivoire as well, and in Uganda, and we saw similar circumstances in Zimbabwe and others. And then there's also conflict in Sudan and many other areas. I think someone has termed it as a constitutional dictatorship, where the constitution which initially meant there were term limits, is changed to include almost unlimited terms. But it's apparently provided for under the constitution, hence the constitutional dictatorship. So in the period leading up to 2009 presidential election, the issue of a third term for Tanja was a source of contention between the president and the other branches of government. Tanja's goal was to extend his rule for another 3 years, during which time a new constitution would be drafted that would move the country from a semi-presidential republic to a full republic. He also cited for the need for continued leadership because of numerous economic development projects that were not yet complete, according to his explanation. Now, to extend his rule, Tanja requested that a referendum be held to change the constitution to allow for the 3-year extension of his term, which the National Assembly refused to approve. He then took his request for the referendum to the country's constitutional court, but on May 26, the court issued a non-binding ruling that the referendum would be unconstitutional without the approval of the National Assembly. Later, almost on the same day, Tanja dissolved the legislative body. And in early June, Tanja created a committee to draft a new constitution, which would provide for the 3-year extension of his rule and would remove the presidential term limits. On June 5th, a presidential decree called for a referendum on his new constitution to be held on August the 4th. Tanger's actions elicited widespread discontent in the country as well as in the international community. Strikes and demonstrations ensued, and a coalition of many political parties and civil groups calling themselves the Front for Defense of Democracy, FDD, challenged the presidential decree before the Constitutional Court, and the resulting court ruling on June 12 annulled the presidential decree, declaring that the referendum could not be held without the approval of the now dissolved National Assembly. This ruling, unlike the court's previous one, was legally binding. Tanger requested that the Constitutional Court rescind its ruling, but it was upheld by the court on June 26. Tanger responded later that day by announcing that he had assumed emergency powers and declaring his intent to rule by decree. 3 days later, he dissolved the constitution. Now, he was not swayed by the increasing criticism of his actions, the accusations that he was circumventing the democratic process, or the pressure from international donors, some of whom threatened to withhold economic aid unless the democratic process was restored. The referendum was held as scheduled on August 4th, although opposition leaders urged voters to boycott it. Official results indicated that more than 92% of the voters approved the referendum, and Tanger would thus be able to remain in power for an additional 3 years after the scheduled end of his term in December 2009. On October 20th, an election was held to replace the National Assembly that Tanger had dissolved in May. The election was boycotted by the opposition and was the target of international criticism. And in the days prior, ECOWAS exhorted Tanger to postpone the election until talks could be held with the opposition. And when its call went unheeded and the election took place as scheduled, ECOWAS suspended Niger's membership in the organization, and election results were announced several days later and indicated that Tanger's party, the MSND, won a majority of the seats. So that's the phase of the constitutional crisis. So we've seen the history, the colonialism, the post-colonial coups, and now the constitutional crisis of 2009 that effectively set the stage for coup after coup up to the point where we are. Now, despite the apparent referendum and election victories, Tanger and his actions remain unpopular with many, and on February 18th, 2010, he was deposed in a coup. Although reports on the incident were initially sort of mixed and conflicting, it was eventually announced that Tanger and other members of the government had been seized by soldiers and were being detained. Later that evening, the coup participants announced the formation of military junta, the Supreme Council for the Restoration of Democracy, and say they had suspended the country's constitution, dissolved all state institutions, and intended to restore democracy. On February 23rd, the junta named former cabinet minister Mahaudou Danda as prime minister, and the 20-member transition government was named on March 1st. A new constitution, which curbed the presidential powers that Tanger had introduced in 2019, was approved by voters in October 2010. The junta held presidential and legislative elections in later, and essentially setting the stage for further actions. And this was around end of January 2011. Now, the Nigerian Party for Democracy and Socialism, that's Niger, not Nigeria, uh, which was an established opposition party, won the greatest representation in the National Assembly by a single party with 39 seats, and it was followed by the MNST with 26 seats. Now, no one presidential candidate received an outright majority, and the runoff election was scheduled for March 12 with the two front-runners, Mahamadou Issoufou, who is a long-time opposition leader and head of the PNDS, who received 36% of the vote, and Seni Umaru, who was a former prime minister and received 23% of the vote. Issoufou was victorious in the runoff election, capturing about 58% of the vote, and he was inaugurated on April 2011, and the country turned to civilian rule. The peaceful transition to democracy was followed by a resumption of foreign aid, which had been frozen after the coup. Now, after that, there were various episodes that continued, and several militant groups had become more active in the region after Issoufou took office, and attacks by those groups within Niger became growing concern. Although there were isolated incidents involving other groups, but the most notable threat was from Boko Haram, which was based in neighboring Nigeria, which had conducted various incidents in the country. And in 2015, it launched an attack in southern Niger, and Niger joined with other countries in the region to combat the group, and soon saw progress on that front. The country also strove to accommodate tens of thousands of refugees who had fled from Boko Haram in northern Nigeria and settled in southern Niger. Meanwhile, a large demonstration was held in Niamey December 2013 by citizens who were angry there had not been notice of progress with improving this country's standards of living under Issoufou, and it was the first such display of discontent since he had taken office. Among other complaints were media censorship, alleged corruption, led by where opposition leaders like Umaru and former Prime Minister Hama Amadou commented on the public's grievances against Issoufou, which provided a glimpse of the nature and the challenge he would likely face in the next presidential election. In December 2015, Issoufou claimed the government had foiled a coup, with several military officers being arrested. Some opposition leaders, however, questioned the claims and accused Issoufou of trying to create drama, quote unquote, ahead of the 2016 presidential and legislative elections. Issoufou was once again the flag bearer of the PNDS and faced 14 challenges for the presidency, the most notable of whom were Amadou of the modern FLA, Umaru of MSND, and former President Soumani of the MNRD. Amadou had the distinction of campaigning from his prison cell, and he was jailed in November 2015 after being charged with involvement in a baby trafficking ring, which he denied. Although a court of appeals would not grant him release from prison on bail, the country's constitutional court did clear the way for him to run for president. Now, the election was held in 2016, I believe, and he earned the most votes, slightly more than 48%. However, since he didn't win more than 50%, he and his nearest challengers, Amadou, who won 17%, were scheduled to face off in the second round of elections due to be held in March. The PNDS wound up with the most legislative seats than any other party, but did not have enough seats to reach a majority in the National Assembly. However, before the runoff was held, the Coalition for Alternative Copper, which was the opposition coalition to which Ahmadu's party belonged, announced that it would boycott the election, alleging that there were irregularities with the electoral process. Also prior to the election, Ahmadu was flown abroad for medical treatment, and surprisingly, he easily won re-election on March 20th, taking 92% of the vote. The country continued to experience attacks from Islamic militant groups, and in 2017 joined several other countries in the region to form the GF Sahel Joint Force to counter threats and improve the security of the country's borders. Now, parts of Niger's borders were, however, still remained insecure in the following years, particularly with Mali in the west and Nigeria in the south, as the population in those areas experienced deadly attacks from the various Islamic militant groups, so-called, anyway, quote-unquote. However, even against the backdrop of ongoing security challenges, some economic progress was made. The country's gross domestic product showed positive growth for much of Issoufou's time in office, and the percentage of the Niger, not Nigerians, living below the poverty line dropped from about 50% in 2011 to about 41% in 2019. Now, beginning in 2020, however, the COVID-19 global pandemic negatively affected the economy. I think it should be said that that applies in most countries all over the world. Niger's next election was held on December 27, 2020, with Issoufou stepping down after serving the constitutionally mandated limit of 2 terms. 30 candidates vied to be his successor. Mohamed Bazoum of Issoufou's PNDS and Mohamed Ousmane received the most votes, about 39% and 17% respectively. But as no one received more than 50%, they advanced to a runoff held on February 21, 2021. Bazoum was announced the winner with more than 55%. His victory was confirmed by the Constitutional Court in March. On March 31st, just days before Bazoum was scheduled to be inaugurated, the government reported that there had been an attempted coup that was quickly put down, and it did not affect or impact the planned transfer of power. On April 2nd, Assoufou stepped down and Bazoum was sworn in as president, marking the first time in the country's history that power was transferred from one democratically elected leader to another. Some 2 years after the inauguration, he was deposed in a military coup that began on July 26, 2023, which is last month, and where he continues to be detained by members of his presidential guard. Military leaders dissolved the government and suspended the constitution, and on July 28th, General Abdulmani Shiani, who had been the head of Bazoum's presidential guard, was named the president of the military junta that would be leading the country. Which then brings us to ECOWAS, which has stepped in and warned of military intervention and gave the deadline of, I think, Sunday, which was yesterday, for the coup leaders to hand over power, release the president, the democratically elected president, or face military action and further punitive measures from the ECOWAS body. And so that's sort of an overview of the history of Niger, where it's come from and where it is. Now, those are just the internal issues. But Niger remains, for whatever reason, a very strategic interest to many global powers, and therefore there has been a lot of international interest, but that's the time for another story. But at the time of recording, the United Nations Secretary General Guterres has issued very strong concerns about the potential loss of life, the return to democratic rule, and how that's going to impact the region in a region that's already facing volatile insecurity, instability in our neighboring countries, coups, Mali, for example, Central African Republic, and other areas. And so he's calling for calm, peace, negotiations. So the ECOWAS region has called for a summit and is due to meet, I think, in a few days to determine what action they should make, given that the ultimatum that expired yesterday, given to the coup leaders, has gone and passed. And that is it in a nutshell. Yet another, sadly, bad governance issue on the African continent, in yet another country that is said to have lots of minerals and so on and so forth. But we don't get into the what's and ifs. We just cover the facts, the issue, and the context, and make it easier for people to make up their own minds and take their own opinions on the issue. In this case, the country of Niger or Niger, depending on how you want to pronounce it, where there was a coup against the democratic elected president. An ultimatum was given by ECOWAS, which passed yesterday, and the coup leaders appear adamant and ready to, in their own words, to defend the integrity of their country. And so there's a standoff there. So we shall see how events develop, and we will update you as events unfold. So there we shall leave it on this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. We shall speak again. Thank you. Goodbye.